Welcome to another video tutorial series by Inquirinity. So this time it will be about cloud infrastructure, and particularly will be focused on Microsoft Azure. But for this video tutorial series, it will be all about Azure DNS Private Resolver. But although the main title is Azure DNS Private Resolver, but for this video tutorial series, we will learn other stuff, like for example, in Microsoft Azure deployment, we will have to configure or to create virtual networks and assign CIDR blocks or IP address subnet for this particular virtual network. So we will have these VNets. We will also learn how to virtual network peer, to provision an Azure private DNS, a DNS forwarding rule set, and the private resolver inbound and outbound endpoint. And finally, in Azure, we will also create the virtual network gateway and establish a site-to-site tunnel connection to our on-premise environment. Also in Microsoft Azure, we will have our compute instances. So we could provision 1 or 2 virtual machines on their assigned spoke virtual networks. So it could be just a standard or regular Windows Server virtual machine with no roles or features. And then on our on-premises environment, so for simplicity, we will also configure this in Azure to act as an on-premise environment. So however, it will be on a different virtual network. We will also have a compute instance that will be a Windows server, and it will have the domain controller and DNS server roles on this particular domain. And for networking, it will also have its VPN gateway to establish a site-to-site connection to the Microsoft Azure on this right side. So this will be an overview or introductory video only, and the end objective of our video tutorial series is the on-premises endpoints. So for example, we have only domain controller here, could reach the other compute instances by their private DNS names. So for example, this is vm1 oncloud.inquiry.com. So take note, we will not have any public IP on these virtual machines. So they will have only private IP, but the connection, because of site-to-site between these two environments, so we could reach the private addresses. But because our objective is in order for our endpoints from whether from on-prem or whether from the Microsoft Azure to resolve their DNS names. So vice versa, or likewise, the virtual machine in Microsoft Azure should be able to resolve the names of the DNS server, for example, which is on the on-prem.inquirinity.com domain. The Azure DNS Private Resolver video tutorial series will commence with the underlying network infrastructure creation. So on our on-premises environment, so this one will carry the 192.168.100.0/24 subnet, and on our Microsoft Azure, the hub virtual network, wherein our virtual network gateway and our resolvers endpoint subnets will reside on 10.100.100.0/24. So we could have 1 or 2 spokes VNets, so that is why haven't decided. So it's here, it's only 1, so 10.200.200.0/24, or we could add another IP subnet for the other or the secondary spoke VNets. So since in our Microsoft Azure underlying network, we will have a hub and spoke VNet configuration. So here you could see the green arrows pointing to the virtual network peering. So the spoke VNet A, for example, this is A and B. So A will connect to the hub via virtual network peering, and B will connect to the hub VNet. So there's no virtual network peering, and we will explain on that video tutorial series the limitations or the considerations for the hub and spoke VNet configuration in Microsoft Azure. Now, once our underlying network is in place on-prem and on the cloud, so next is to create the Azure private DNS zone, for example, on cloud.inquirity.com, and we will configure the virtual network link configuration. So for this VNet to this DNS zone, this spoke VNet A or B, for example, to this DNS zone. And then it's time to provision our compute instances. So for example, in our on-prem, we will have our Windows server, and we will promote it, or we will add the roles for Active Directory domain services and DNS services, and we will promote it as a domain controller and also a DNS server. And like mentioned previously, we will have our Azure virtual machine with Windows server, and we will not configure any rows. We'll just provision one virtual machine, assigned an IP address, and we could have another virtual machine on another spoke VNet as well. Then in this video, we will verify whether the virtual machines and the configuration with the virtual network link auto registration or manual registration. We'll also explain when that time comes. We'll verify whether our virtual machines names are registered or are here on the private DNS zone, which is the oncloud.inquirity.com. So with our Azure private DNS settled and our Azure virtual machines registered to that Azure DNS, and also we have promoted this particular server as a domain controller and a DNS server, comes next is the provisioning of the Azure DNS private resolver itself. And we will assign an inbound endpoint and an outbound endpoint. So once we have the inbound endpoint IP, so we could now configure in our DNS server a conditional forwarder. So indicated here is company.com because it could be a generic one. So we could point it to the oncloud.inquirity.com. It could be not on cloud, it could be a different DNS name as well. For example, you have a different Azure private DNS zone here. So here it should be oncloud.inquirity.com, pointing to the Azure inbound endpoint IP address. And then, so for our outbound endpoint, so we will have our DNS forwarding rule set. So for example, this is dc.onprem.inquirity.com. It will point to our on-prem DNS server. So our virtual machines will refer to this DNS forwarding rule set by virtue of DNS forwarding virtual network link on the spoke VNets, and it will have this particular singular record. For example, we have only one dc.onprem.inquirity.com pointing to the on-premise DNS server. We could have an app server here, we could have a different endpoints IP here or a DNS name, so we could have also a different record here in our DNS forwarding rule set. And then finally, once our private resolver infrastructure are configured or set up, so we have our inbound endpoint, our outbound endpoint, our domain controller is correctly pointing to the Azure inbound endpoint IP, and we have a forwarding rule set that is also pointing to the on-prem DNS server IP. So there will be no reachability, because if you point to the Azure inbound IP or vice versa from Azure to DNS server, so they could not reach even the IP address, because of course there was no connectivity here. So the video tutorial for this stage will now be how to connect our on-premise and our Microsoft Azure. So now, by virtue of creating a virtual network gateway and creating a site-to-site connection, so we will go through the site-to-site connection setup, the phase 1 and the phase 2 proposals, and we will see if the tunnel is up. We will also revisit the virtual network peering, because now it's not spoke VNet to private resolver or the hub VNet only, or spoke VNet then wants to talk to another spoke VNet, so hub VNet to spoke VNet. So the communication now is not only within Microsoft Azure, but how it will traverse from the hub VNet using the virtual network gateway going to the on-prem. So we will revisit the virtual network peering settings on that particular scenario wherein our virtual machines could reach, for example, the IP address first or to test our site-to-site connection. And then lastly, once we finish and hopefully configured correctly the settings for our Azure private DNS resolver, the private DNS, and our site-to-site connection, we would hope that we will meet or complete or attain our end goal, which is for on-prem or the Azure virtual machines will resolve the DNS names, so vice versa. So for on-prem DNS or DC, for example, it will have to resolve the DNS name of this virtual machine, and for this virtual machine to also resolve the DNS name of this on-prem DC and DNS server. So we do hope that you will stay tuned for the upcoming videos for this video tutorial series for Azure DNS Private Resolver, and hope you will learn something on the configuration, so between the on-premises environment and Microsoft Azure, or this one will be a Azure environment as well, for our domain controller or even other endpoints to reach privately the virtual machine, so not only reaching via the IP address but also resolving their DNS names.